The rain hit my windshield like tiny hammers, each drop blurring my already limited view of the desolate highway ahead. The wipers worked furiously, but the storm refused to let up. The clock on the dashboard read 10:47 p.m., though it felt much later. The road stretched endlessly before me, flanked by shadowy trees swaying violently in the wind. There wasn't another soul in sight. I leaned forward, gripping the wheel tightly, trying to keep the car steady against the gusts. The radio crackled with static, interrupted by occasional fragments of an old country song that couldn't seem to find its rhythm. I had turned it down long ago, but the faint, distorted melody still crept through the speakers, adding to the unsettling isolation of the drive. A flicker of movement caught my eye, illuminated briefly by my headlights. At first, I thought it was the rain playing tricks on me, but as I squinted through the downpour, I saw him, a figure standing on the side of the road, arm outstretched, thumb pointed skyward. A hitchhiker. My instinct was to keep driving. It wasn't exactly the safest situation, and the horror stories I'd heard over the years came rushing back. But as I passed him, guilt gnawed at me. He was soaked to the bone, his clothes clinging to him in the storm, and the idea of leaving someone out here felt cruel. Against my better judgment, I slowed the car and pulled over. The figure jogged up to the passenger side, his face obscured by the brim of a baseball cap and the relentless sheets of rain. I cracked the window slightly. "Need a ride?" I called out. "Yeah, thanks," he replied, his voice low but clear. He didn't hesitate, opening the door and climbing in before I could say anything more. Water pooled on the seat beneath him, and the smell of damp earth filled the car. "Where are you headed?" I asked, trying to keep my tone casual as I eased back onto the highway. "Just up ahead," he said vaguely, gesturing toward the windshield. His hands rested on his knees, and he stared straight ahead, the brim of his cap casting shadows over his face. "There's a gas station about 5 miles up. You can drop me there." I nodded, keeping my eyes on the road. The silence between us was thick, broken only by the drumming rain and the occasional groan of the car's engine. I glanced at him out of the corner of my eye. He was lean, his clothes plain and nondescript, a gray hoodie and jeans. Something about him felt off. Maybe it was the way he sat so still or how he avoided looking at me. I couldn't put my finger on it, but unease began to creep in. "So," I started, hoping to break the tension, "what were you doing out there in this weather?" He didn't answer right away. When he finally spoke, his voice was distant. "Just trying to get somewhere." "Not very specific," I muttered under my breath, though I wasn't sure he heard me. The gas station came into view sooner than I expected. Its neon sign flickered weakly, and a single pump sat beneath a sagging awning. The place looked as worn down as the man sitting beside me. I pulled into the lot and stopped the car. "This good?" I asked, glancing at him. "Yeah," he said, already reaching for the door handle. He stepped out without another word, the rain immediately swallowing him as he disappeared toward the station. I sat there for a moment, watching him go, then shook my head and put the car in drive. A mile or two down the road, I noticed something out of place on the passenger seat. It was small, almost unnoticeable, but the dark shape stood out against the gray upholstery. I picked it up, a folded piece of paper, damp at the edges. Unfolding it, I read the words scrawled in jagged handwriting, "Check the back seat." My chest tightened. I froze, gripping the paper so tightly that it crumpled in my hand. Slowly, I adjusted the rearview mirror, angling it toward the back seat. There was nothing there, just the faint outline of my duffel bag and a few loose papers. Still, the words on the note sent a chill racing down my spine. I flipped on the cabin light and twisted in my seat to get a better look. The back seat was empty. Empty, but the sense of dread refused to leave me. I opened the door and stepped out into the rain, my flashlight from the glove compartment in hand. The beam cut through the darkness as I searched the car's interior, my breath coming faster with each passing second. There was nothing, no sign of anyone or anything out of the ordinary. But as I stood there, drenched and shivering in the rain, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I climbed back into the car, slamming the door behind me. My hands trembled as I started the engine, and the warmth of the heater did little to calm the cold knot of fear in my stomach. Whatever this was, it wasn't over. The storm hadn't let up. The rain was relentless, pounding against the roof of the car like a warning I couldn't decipher. My grip on the steering wheel was so tight my knuckles ached. The note, now crumpled, sat on the passenger seat like an accusation. "Check the back seat." Those 3 words echoed in my mind, each repetition feeding the growing pit in my stomach. I tried to focus on the road, but every shadow cast by the trees on either side seemed alive. The faint glow of the dashboard lights illuminated the empty space around me, yet the feeling of being watched refused to leave. My breath fogged the windshield as I exhaled, shaky and uneven. What if I'd missed something? What if the note wasn't a prank or an accident? Against my better judgment, I reached over and grabbed the note again, studying the jagged handwriting. It looked rushed, almost desperate, as if whoever wrote it had little time to think. But how had it gotten there? I hadn't seen the hitchhiker leave anything behind. He'd barely moved the entire ride. I glanced at the rearview mirror again. Nothing. The back seat was still as empty as before, but the paranoia had lodged itself firmly in my mind. I flicked my eyes back to the road just in time to swerve around a branch that had fallen into my lane. The tires skidded on the slick pavement, and the car fishtailed before I regained control. "Get a grip, Ryan," I muttered to myself, though the words felt hollow. My heart was racing, and no amount of deep breath seemed to steady it. As I drove, the faint glow of lights appeared ahead. Another gas station, though this one looked slightly better maintained than the last. I pulled in, telling myself it was just for coffee, maybe a moment to clear my head. The truth was I didn't want to be in the car anymore. The station was eerily quiet, the fluorescent lights above the pumps flickering faintly. Inside, a clerk sat behind the counter, scrolling through his phone. I stepped out, letting the rain wash over me for a second before darting inside. The warmth and the hum of the overhead lights were a strange comfort, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. As I poured myself a cup of coffee, my eyes wandered toward the window. The car sat there, lonely and drenched under the rain. It looked ordinary, just a sedan with a few miles on it, but the sight of it filled me with unease. I caught myself glancing over my shoulder as if expecting someone or something to appear behind me. "You all right?" the clerk asked, his voice startling me. I nearly spilled the coffee as I turned to him. "Yeah, just long night," I said, forcing a weak smile. He nodded, barely interested, and went back to his phone. I paid for the coffee and lingered near the counter for a moment, hesitating to step back into the storm. It wasn't the rain I was avoiding, it was the car. I didn't want to get back inside. Finally, with a resigned sigh, I headed back out. The rain had lessened to a steady drizzle, but the cold had crept into my bones. I slid into the driver's seat and shut the door, the interior of the car feeling even smaller now. The scent of damp fabric was stronger, mixed with something faintly metallic. My hands were shaking again, though I wasn't sure if it was from the cold or the nerves. I reached for the ignition, but my hand froze midway. A sound, faint but distinct. It came from the back seat, a soft, deliberate shifting noise, like fabric brushing against leather. My breath caught in my throat as I turned, slowly this time, my heart hammering so loudly I could barely hear the rain. The back seat was empty. I stared at it for what felt like an eternity, half expecting something to materialize from the shadows. But there was nothing. No movement, no sound, nothing but the steady patter of rain against the windows. I turned back to face the front, gripping the wheel so tightly it hurt. As I sat there trying to convince myself that I was imagining things, I noticed it. A smudge on the inside of the rear windshield. A handprint, faint and distorted, as if someone had pressed their palm against the glass from inside. It hadn't been there before. The pit in my stomach deepened as I realized the truth. I wasn't alone. I stared at the handprint, my mind racing for an explanation. The smudge was faint, distorted by the streaks of rain on the outside of the glass, but it was undeniably there. My pulse thundered in my ears as I sat frozen, my grip on the wheel slackening. The car was silent, save for the steady patter of the rain, but the quiet felt heavy, oppressive. Someone had been here, maybe still was. I turned slowly, scanning the back seat for any sign of movement. The shadows stretched and shifted with each passing car on the distant highway, creating fleeting illusions of figures lurking just out of sight. My breath fogged up the windows as I forced myself to move. grabbing my flashlight from the glove compartment. The beam of light cut through the darkness as I opened the driver's door, stepping out into the drizzle. The air was cold and damp, the rain soaking through my jacket as I circled the car. My flashlight trembled slightly in my hand as I inspected the back seat through the windows, but nothing appeared out of the ordinary. I hesitated before opening the back door, my hand hovering over the handle. My stomach churned as I pulled it open. The seat was empty. Just the damp upholstery and the faint scent of rainwater mixed with something metallic, like blood, but subtler. I shone the light across the floor, then leaned in to check the space between the seats. Still nothing. Frustrated, I stepped back and slammed the door shut. My flashlight caught the rear windshield again, and the handprint was gone. My chest tightened as I stumbled back, my foot slipping slightly on the wet asphalt. I wiped the glass with my sleeve, but it was clean. No smudge, no evidence it had ever been there. I hurried back to the driver's seat, slamming the door and locking it. The paranoia gnawed at me as I started the engine, the headlights cutting through the foggy night. I needed to keep moving, to get to the nearest town and figure out what was happening. The empty highway stretched out ahead of me like a dark tunnel, and I pressed down on the accelerator. The unease only grew as I drove. My mind replayed the note, the sound in the back seat, the handprint that had vanished. The rain had lightened to a mist, but it clung to the windows, distorting the world outside. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was behind me, just out of sight. As the miles ticked by, I glanced into the rearview mirror again. For a moment, everything seemed normal. Then I saw it, a figure in the back seat, faint and barely visible, but unmistakable. My heart lurched as I swerved instinctively, the tires screeching as the car fishtailed. The figure vanished as quickly as it had appeared. I pulled to the side of the road, my chest heaving as I fought for air. My hands gripped the steering wheel, white-knuckled and trembling. I didn't dare look in the mirror again. Instead, I reached for my phone, fumbling to call someone, anyone, to make sense of this. As I unlocked the screen, a new message popped up. It was from an unknown number. Stop looking. I stared at the text, my breath catching in my throat. The words felt like a command, and for a moment, I considered abandoning the car altogether, running down the road until I found someone who could help. But I couldn't leave the car. It was the only thing keeping me grounded, keeping me safe. I forced myself to drive again, my eyes fixed on the road ahead. The town wasn't far now. I could see the faint glow of streetlights in the distance, a beacon of safety after the night I'd endured. My hands gripped the wheel tighter as I whispered to myself, almost there. Just keep going. As I approached the town limits, a sudden jolt shook the car as if I'd hit something. I slammed on the brakes, my body lurching forward with the momentum. The car skidded to a stop, and I sat there, panting, too afraid to move. I stepped out cautiously, the flashlight trembling in my hand as I circled the car. There was no sign of anything in the road, no animal, no debris. But as I rounded the back of the car, I saw it. Another handprint, smeared on the trunk, darker and more pronounced than the first. My flashlight flickered, and for a brief second I thought I heard the faintest sound, a low, rhythmic hum, almost like a whisper coming from the forest that lined the road. I didn't stop to investigate. I jumped back into the car and sped off toward the lights of the town, my heart pounding as the hum seemed to follow me, growing fainter with each passing mile. By the time I reached the town, the sound was gone, replaced by the familiar noise of civilization, cars, voices, and the hum of neon signs. But the paranoia remained. Even now, as I sit in this diner writing these words, I can't shake the feeling that I'm being watched. And no matter how much I try, I can't stop checking the back seat. The air smelled like pine and damp earth as Liam and I hiked deeper into the woods, the trail narrowing with each step. The last stretch of sunlight filtered through the towering trees, casting long, flickering shadows over the mossy ground. I adjusted the straps of my backpack, the weight of the camera gear pulling at my shoulders, and glanced back at Liam. He was a few steps behind, his brow furrowed as he scanned the forest like a soldier on patrol. "This place is unreal," I said, trying to lighten the mood. "Feels like we've stepped into a postcard." Liam grunted in response, his grip tightening on the walking stick he'd picked up earlier. "Unreal's a word for it," he muttered, his tone sharp, though I couldn't tell if it was from exertion or unease. We were heading to a secluded campsite I'd read about online, miles from the nearest road, tucked away in the heart of the Willamette National Forest. It was supposed to be a haven for stargazing, and I'd been itching to capture long-exposure shots of the Milky Way. Liam, ever the loyal friend, had agreed to join, though he clearly wasn't here for the photography. By the time we reached the clearing, the sun had dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in bands of fiery orange and deep purple. The spot was perfect, a small open patch surrounded by towering evergreens, the ground carpeted in soft needles. I dropped my pack with a relieved sigh and began setting up camp while Liam circled the perimeter, still in that hyper-alert mode. "You're acting like we're in enemy territory," I teased as I unrolled my sleeping bag. "Maybe we are," he shot back, pausing to inspect a tree trunk. "Look at this." I walked over, curious, and saw the markings he'd found. Jagged carvings etched into the bark, forming symbols I didn't recognize. They looked old, weathered, and meaningless to me. But Liam's jaw tightened. "Probably kids messing around," I said with a shrug. "Or not." Liam stepped back, his gaze darting to the surrounding trees. "Let's keep our guard up." We built a small fire and sat in its warmth, the crackle of burning wood filling the silence. Overhead, the stars emerged one by one, and I couldn't help but marvel at the vastness above us. It was moments like this that made everything else, work stress, city noise, constant notifications, fade into the background. But Liam was restless. His eyes kept flicking toward the darkness beyond the firelight, his shoulders stiff. "You don't hear that?" he asked suddenly, breaking the quiet. "Hear what?" I frowned, setting down my mug of instant coffee. He didn't answer, just tilted his head, listening. I strained my ears, but all I caught was the usual forest symphony. Crickets chirping, leaves rustling in the breeze. Still, his unease was contagious, and I found myself glancing over my shoulder more often than necessary. "Relax, man," I said, forcing a laugh. "We're probably the only people within miles of here." Liam didn't respond. He just poked at the fire with a stick, sending up a shower of sparks. When the fire began to die down, I crawled into my tent, exhausted from the hike. Sleep came quickly, but it was shallow, restless, and filled with strange dreams of shadowy figures moving through the trees. A noise woke me. It was faint at first, a low, rhythmic sound like footsteps crunching over leaves. I froze, heart pounding, straining to hear over the muffled hum of my own breathing. There it was again, closer this time. "Liam," I whispered, unzipping the tent just enough to peer out. His tent was a shadowy lump a few feet away, silent and still. I crawled out, clutching my flashlight like a weapon. The beam cut through, the dense darkness illuminated the damp forest floor and the jagged shadows of the surrounding trees. The footsteps stopped abruptly, and an unsettling silence followed, thick as the fog that had begun to roll in. My breath hitched as I scanned the perimeter, half expecting to see a pair of glowing eyes staring back at me, but there was nothing, just the forest, vast and impenetrable. "Liam," I called again, louder this time, and relief washed over me as his tent unzipped. He emerged, clutching his walking stick, eyes sharp and alert. "You hear it too?" he asked, his voice low. "Yeah," I whispered, nodding toward the trees. "Footsteps. Right over there." Liam didn't hesitate. He clicked on his flashlight and moved toward the edge of the clearing, every step careful and deliberate. I followed closely, my heart hammering against my ribs. The air felt colder here, the towering trees pressing in like silent sentinels. We didn't have to go far before we found it. Footprints, fresh and deep, pressed into the soft forest floor. They were human, barefoot, and much larger than either of ours. Liam crouched beside them, his fingers brushing the edges of the prints as if measuring their depth. "These aren't old," he murmured, his voice grim. "Who the hell's out here without shoes?" I didn't have an answer. The thought of someone wandering the forest barefoot in the middle of the night sent a chill down my spine. Liam stood, scanning the surrounding trees with a tight grip on his stick. "Let's head back," he said. No point in looking for trouble. We turned to leave, but a sound froze us in our tracks. A low, guttural humming, eerie and rhythmic, carried on the breeze. It was coming from deeper in the woods, faint but unmistakable. My flashlight shook in my hand as I searched the darkness for the source, but the trees seemed to swallow the light whole. "Did you hear that?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "Yeah," Liam said. "Stay close." We retreated to the camp, but the sense of safety the fire had once provided was gone. The humming had stopped, but the air felt charged with tension, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. Liam paced the edge of the clearing, his gaze darting between the trees while I busied myself stoking the fire, desperate for the comfort of its light. "Maybe it's just someone passing through," I said, though even I didn't believe it. "In the middle of the night? Barefoot?" Liam shot back, his tone sharp. "No, this isn't right." I didn't argue. The unease in his voice mirrored the growing pit in my stomach. The fire crackled louder than before, but it wasn't enough to drown out the nagging thought that we weren't alone. We agreed to take turns keeping watch, though neither of us expected to get much sleep. Liam took the first shift, sitting by the fire with his stick across his lap like a weapon. I crawled back into my tent, but sleep was impossible. Every sound outside, every rustle of leaves or snap of a twig, sent my mind racing. Just as I began to drift off, a sharp noise pierced the quiet, a high-pitched scream, distant but unmistakable. My eyes flew open and I bolted upright, scrambling out of the tent. Liam was already on his feet, his flashlight aimed toward the source of the sound. "Stay here," he ordered, but I ignored him, grabbing my own light and following close behind as he headed into the trees. The scream had come from the same direction as the footprints, and dread coiled tighter in my chest with every step we took. We didn't get far before the beam of Liam's flashlight landed on something that made my stomach lurch. It was another circle of stones, larger than the first, arranged with deliberate precision. In the center was a pile of charred wood, still smoldering faintly. Around the edges were more of those strange carvings, etched into pieces of bark and bone. "What the hell is this?" I whispered, my voice trembling. Before Liam could answer, we heard it again, the humming. This time it was closer, louder, and unmistakably human. The sound rose and fell like a chant, sending goosebumps crawling up my arms. We turned as one, and there, just beyond the edge of the light, stood a figure. The man was tall and gaunt, his bare chest smeared with streaks of ash and mud. His eyes gleamed in the dark, wide and unblinking, as he clutched a crooked staff adorned with dangling bones. He didn't move, didn't speak, just stared at us, the rhythmic humming pouring from his lips like a spell. "Run," Liam said, his voice barely audible. "Now." Neither of us needed to be told twice. We turned and sprinted back toward the campsite, the sound of the humming chasing us through the trees. My lungs burned as I ran, but the only thought in my mind was escape. When we reached the clearing, I glanced back. The figure was gone, but the sense of unease lingered, heavy and suffocating. We packed our things in frantic silence, neither of us willing to spend another moment in that cursed place. But as we loaded our gear and prepared to leave, something caught my eye, a symbol carved into the ground near the fire, fresh and unmistakable. It was a warning, or perhaps a promise. Whatever it meant, one thing was clear. We weren't supposed to be here. The drive back to the ranger station felt endless. Liam's knuckles were white as he gripped the steering wheel, his jaw clenched tight. I sat in the passenger seat, staring blankly out the window, the rhythmic hum of the tires on the gravel road the only sound between us. My chest was tight, my mind racing through everything we'd seen and heard. The man's unblinking stare, the chanting, the symbols. It all felt like a nightmare that had clawed its way into reality. "We need to report this," Liam said finally, breaking the silence. His voice was steady, but I could hear the edge of unease beneath it. "Whatever's going on out there, it's not normal." I nodded, my throat dry. "Do you think anyone will believe us?" They'll have to," Liam replied. "We've got the footprints, the symbols, hell, even the guy himself. Someone's got to know something about him." When we arrived at the ranger station, the fluorescent lights inside were a harsh contrast to the dim, shadowy forest we'd just left. A stocky man in a tan uniform sat behind the desk, sipping coffee and flipping through a magazine. His name tag read, "Sheriff Tom Barlow." "Help you boys with something?" he asked, barely glancing up. Liam stepped forward, his military composure kicking in. "We just got back from a campsite in the Willamette Forest. There's a man out there, barefoot, chanting, leaving symbols everywhere. He attacked us." That got the sheriff's attention. He set down his coffee and leaned back in his chair, studying us with a furrowed brow. Slow down. Start from the beginning. We recounted everything. The footprints, the markings on the trees, the stone circles, and finally, the gaunt man with the staff. As we spoke, the sheriff's expression shifted from skepticism to something that looked uncomfortably like recognition. "You boys stumbled into Victor Hayes' territory," he said finally, leaning forward with a heavy sigh. "I'd bet my badge on it." "Victor Hayes?" I asked, the name unfamiliar. The sheriff nodded. "He used to live around here back when the area was more populated. Lost his wife and kids in a house fire about 10 years ago. Something snapped after that. He moved out into the forest, started doing strange things, rituals, chants. Locals say he's trying to bring his family back. Why hasn't anyone done anything about him?" Liam asked, his voice hard. "He attacked us. He's dangerous." The sheriff shook his head. "He's not easy to find. Moves around constantly, stays off the radar. And let's be honest, most folks around here steer clear of that part of the woods. You boys were in the wrong place at the wrong time." The explanation didn't sit well with either of us. Liam leaned forward, his jaw tight. "So you're just going to let him keep scaring people? What happens when he does more than just attack?" The sheriff met Liam's gaze evenly. "Look, I get it. You're upset. But Hayes isn't some criminal mastermind. He's a broken man living in the past. I can send some deputies to check the area, but don't expect much. That forest swallows people whole. Always has." I wanted to argue, to demand that more be done, but Liam placed a hand on my shoulder. "Let's go," he said quietly. "We're not getting anywhere here." As we stepped outside, the sun was beginning to rise, casting the world in soft, golden light. But it didn't feel comforting. The forest loomed in the distance, its shadows deeper and darker than ever. "What now?" I asked, my voice hollow. "We get out of here," Liam said, unlocking the car, "and we don't come back." Weeks passed, but the events of that night refused to fade. I found myself obsessively researching Victor Hayes, piecing together fragments of his story. Newspaper clippings described the fire that had claimed his family, the disappearance of a man who had once been a respected member of the community. But there was nothing about his rituals or the symbols we'd seen. It was as if the forest had erased all traces of him, just as the sheriff had said. Liam and I barely spoke about it. Whenever I brought it up, he shut it down, insisting that we'd been lucky to get out alive. But the memories haunted me, the chilling hum of the chant, the unrelenting stare of the man in the shadows. Then one night, I woke to a sound that turned my blood to ice. Humming. The same low, rhythmic melody, faint but unmistakable. My heart pounded as I sat up, scanning the dark room. The sound seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere all at once. I rushed to the window, throwing open the curtains. The street outside was empty, bathed in the orange glow of a distant street lamp. But just as I was about to turn away, something caught my eye. A shadowy figure standing at the edge of the woods, barely visible against the trees. It was him, Victor Hayes. I stumbled back from the window, my breath coming in shallow gasps. When I looked again, the figure was gone, swallowed by the darkness. The next morning, I called Liam, my hands shaking as I relayed what I'd seen. He was quiet for a long moment before finally speaking. "Ethan," he said, his voice heavy, "some things are better left alone." I wanted to argue, to tell him that we couldn't ignore this. But deep down, I knew he was right. Whatever was out there, whatever Victor Hayes had become, wasn't something we could fight. The forest had its own rules, its own secrets, and we had barely escaped with our lives. But even now, as I write this, I can't shake the feeling that it's not over, that the forest isn't done with us, and that someday, somehow, it will call us back. The road stretched endlessly ahead of me, a ribbon of asphalt cutting through the cold, empty plains of Wyoming. The hum of the engine was the only companion to the steady thrum of tires against the pavement. My headlights cut through the darkness, illuminating patches of snow along the roadside. The radio played softly in the background, some forgotten country tune crackling through the static, but it did little to fill the emptiness of the night. It was just past midnight, and the air outside was bitterly cold. I could feel it creeping in through the edges of the windows, despite the heater working overtime. Nights like this had become a routine. long hauls across desolate stretches of America with nothing but coffee and the sound of my own thoughts to keep me awake. I took a sip from the lukewarm mug in the cup holder, grimacing at the bitterness. My eyes darted to the dashboard clock. I still had another 100 miles before the next scheduled rest stop, another 100 miles of nothingness. It was then that I saw him. A figure appeared in the distance, barely visible in the glow of my high beams. He stood at the edge of the road, motionless, his hand outstretched in a universal gesture, thumb pointing up. A hitchhiker. I tightened my grip on the wheel, my instincts immediately telling me to keep driving. Picking up strangers in the dead of night was a gamble I wasn't keen on taking, especially on a road this remote. As I got closer, though, I couldn't help but notice his appearance. He was thin, his clothes loose and worn, and he didn't have a coat. The frigid wind tugged at his shirt, and he shivered visibly. Something about him looked desperate, vulnerable. I slowed the truck, the headlights washing over him as I pulled to the side. My conscience wouldn't let me leave him out there, not in weather like this. He jogged up to the passenger door, his movements stiff from the cold. I leaned over to unlock it, and he climbed in without a word. The cabin filled with the sharp scent of wet clothes and the faint metallic tang of cold air. He shut the door and sat there, his hands resting on his knees as he stared straight ahead. His face was obscured by the shadow of a baseball cap pulled low, but I caught a glimpse of pale skin and hollow cheeks. "Where are you headed?" I asked, trying to break the silence. "Up the road," he said quietly, his voice barely audible over the engine. "Wherever you're going is fine." It wasn't much of an answer, but I didn't press. He looked like he'd been through enough already. I nodded, shifting the truck back into gear and pulling onto the highway. The air in the cabin felt heavier now, the silence between us thick and uncomfortable. I glanced at him out of the corner of my eye. He sat perfectly still, his hands clenched together tightly, his gaze fixed on the windshield. The faint glow from the dashboard illuminated his profile, and for a moment I thought I saw the corner of his mouth twitch into a smile. "So," I ventured, my voice sounding too loud in the confined space, "been out here long?" "Long enough," he replied, his tone flat. His response hung in the air like a dead weight, and I let the conversation drop. The radio crackled again, the static swelling and receding like the ocean. I reached over to adjust the dial, trying to find a clearer station. The faint hum of voices emerged briefly before being swallowed by the noise again. When I turned back to the road, I noticed he hadn't moved. He still sat there, rigid and unblinking, his hands gripping his knees so tightly that his knuckles were white. Something about him unsettled me, though I couldn't quite pinpoint why. Maybe it was the way he avoided looking at me, or how his responses were clipped and distant, or maybe it was the way the shadows seemed to cling to him, even in the light of the cabin. The road stretched on, endless and unchanging, and the man beside me remained a quiet enigma. As the miles passed, I began to feel a subtle but growing unease, like a faint vibration beneath the surface of something solid. I couldn't shake the feeling that I just made a mistake I'd regret. The highway seemed to grow darker the further we went, the faint glow of snow on the roadside barely enough to break the oppressive black of the plains around us. My headlights stretched out ahead, their beams swallowing mile after mile of empty road, but the feeling of unease clung to me like a heavy fog. The man, Eli, as he had introduced himself, sat silent beside me, his presence filling the cabin with an unspoken tension. I glanced at him out of the corner of my eye, trying to piece together some understanding of who he was. His hands rested on his lap, fingers intertwined in a motionless grip. He hadn't moved since he climbed into the truck, hadn't shifted or adjusted himself, as though he were carved from stone. His cap still hid most of his face, but the faint light from the dashboard cast sharp shadows across his hollow cheeks. The silence was unbearable. "So, where exactly do you need to go?" I asked, my voice forced and overly casual. "Just up the road," he said, his voice flat and emotionless. "That's pretty vague," I muttered under my breath, though I wasn't sure he heard me. His lack of specificity didn't sit right with me, but I wasn't about to pry. Something about him warned against it. The radio crackled again, spitting out static and brief snatches of a song I couldn't place. I reached over to turn it down, the white noise somehow amplifying the oppressive quiet of the truck. That was when I noticed Eli's head turn slightly, his eyes shifting toward me for the first time since he'd gotten in. "What are you hauling?" he asked suddenly, his tone casual but somehow off. The question took me by surprise, not because it was strange, but because of how unexpected it felt coming from him. "Electronics," I replied, trying to keep my tone light. "TVs, speakers, that kind of thing. Nothing exciting." He nodded slowly, as though considering my answer. His gaze lingered on me for a moment longer before he turned back to the windshield, his shoulders stiffening as if bracing for something. I tried to focus on the road, but my grip on the wheel tightened. There was something about him, something in the way he moved, the way he spoke, that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. It wasn't fear exactly, but a gnawing unease, like I was sitting next to a coiled spring, waiting to snap. As we passed a cluster of gnarled trees at the edge of the road, Eli leaned forward slightly, his eyes narrowing. "Do you believe in fate?" he asked, his voice low. The question caught me off guard. "Fate?" I repeated, frowning. "Not really. I think we make our own choices." He didn't respond right away. Instead, his lips curled into a faint smile, a slow, deliberate expression that didn't reach his eyes. "Sometimes," he said finally, "choices don't matter. Sometimes you're just where you're meant to be." A shiver ran down my spine, and I couldn't tell if it was the cold or his words that caused it. "That's a pretty grim way of looking at things," I said, trying to sound dismissive. He didn't reply. The smile faded, replaced by an unsettling stillness. For a moment, the only sound was the rhythmic thrum of the tires on the asphalt. We drove on in silence, but the tension in the cabin was suffocating. I kept stealing glances at him, half expecting him to do something. Move, speak, anything. But he remained still, his presence a looming weight in the corner of my vision. The rest stop finally came into view, a faint halo of light on the horizon. Relief flooded me at the thought of dropping him off, of escaping the oppressive energy that filled the truck. But as we got closer, I noticed Eli's posture shift for the first time. He straightened slightly, his head tilting to one side as though listening for something I couldn't hear. "You can drop me here," he said abruptly, his voice breaking the silence like a crack of thunder. I nodded, too eager to end the ride to question it. As I pulled into the parking lot, I turned to tell him we'd arrived, but the passenger seat was empty. The door hadn't opened, and there was no sign of him anywhere. My chest tightened as I scanned the lot, my pulse pounding in my ears. Eli was gone, completely impossibly gone. I sat frozen in the driver's seat, my eyes glued to the empty space beside me. My hands gripped the wheel so tightly my knuckles ached. The passenger door was still locked, and I hadn't heard it open. Yet Eli was gone. No trace of him, no sound, no movement, just the hollow emptiness of the seat he had occupied moments before. The truck's engine hummed steadily, an anchor to reality as my thoughts raced. I glanced at the rearview mirror, expecting to see him outside, standing in the shadows of the poorly lit rest stop. But there was nothing. The parking lot was deserted, the faint glow of a flickering neon sign casting long, empty stretches of light over the asphalt. I turned off the engine and stepped out of the cab, my boots crunching against the gravel as I scanned the area. The night was bitterly cold, and the wind howled through the lot, carrying with it the faint scent of diesel and wet asphalt. I walked around the truck, my flashlight sweeping over the ground, searching for any sign of him. Footprints, movement, anything. "Eli?" I called, my voice sounding small against the vast emptiness. The only response was the low groan of the wind and the distant rattle of a loose metal sign. My breath formed thick clouds in the air, and I realized how still everything felt. The kind of stillness that didn't feel natural. I circled back to the driver's side, my nerves fraying with each passing second. As I reached for the door handle, something caught my eye, a faint shape on the passenger side window. I stepped closer, shining my flashlight on the glass. A handprint. It was faint, as though pressed lightly into the condensation from Eli's breath earlier, but it was there. The sight of it sent a chill racing down my spine. My mind churned, trying to rationalize it. He'd been sitting there. It could have been from earlier, but something about it felt wrong. The fingers seemed longer, thinner, as if they belonged to someone else entirely. I climbed back into the cab, slamming the door behind me and locking it with trembling hands. My breathing was uneven, and the tightness in my chest made it hard to focus. I turned the key in the ignition, desperate to leave the rest stop behind. As the truck roared to life, my headlights swept over the lot, briefly illuminating the edge of the woods beyond. For a split second, I thought I saw someone standing just beyond the tree line. A pale figure, motionless and indistinct, its features lost in the shadows. My heart stopped and I blinked, straining to see it again. But the headlights had already shifted, and the figure was gone. I floored the accelerator, the tires kicking up gravel as I sped out of the rest stop and back onto the highway. My chest heaved as I tried to convince myself it was just my imagination, that the tension and the long night were playing tricks on me. But the further I drove, the more the feeling of being watched grew. The darkness outside seemed alive, pressing against the windows of the cab like it wanted to get in. I couldn't bring myself to glance at the passenger seat, too afraid of what I might see. The radio crackled to life suddenly, startling me. Static hissed through the speakers, interspersed with faint voices that I couldn't make out. I reached for the dial to turn it off, but my hand froze as I heard it. A low, distorted voice, calm and deliberate. "Didn't I say you'd take me where I needed to be?" My blood ran cold. I stared at the radio, my hands gripping the wheel as my mind scrambled to make sense of what I'd just heard. The voice faded back into static, and I jabbed at the power button, silencing it. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the rhythmic hum of the engine and my own ragged breathing. I drove for what felt like hours, though the clock told me it had only been minutes. When I finally reached a well-lit truck stop, I pulled in, parked, and turned off the engine. The cabin was plunged into stillness, and for the first time that night, I dared to look at the passenger seat. It was empty. I sat there for a long time, my hands trembling in my lap. The events of the night felt like a fever dream, something impossible to explain or understand. But as I reached for the door handle to step out, I caught a glimpse of something in the corner of the windshield. Another handprint. This one was clearer, pressed firmly against the glass from the inside, the fingers impossibly long and thin. My chest tightened as I backed away from the door, my breath catching in my throat. The wind outside howled louder, and for a brief moment I thought I heard laughter, soft, distant, and chilling. I never picked up another hitchhiker again. But every time I drive these lonely highways at night, I can't help but glance at the passenger seat, half expecting to see him sitting there, smiling that faint, unsettling smile, waiting. The house was quiet, just as I liked it. A faint hum from the heater filled the stillness, blending with the occasional creak of the old wood floors as the winter air settled in. I had lived here for 6 months now, a modest 2-story home tucked away in a quiet suburb in Oregon. It wasn't much, but it was perfect for me. Space to work, space to think, and most importantly, no distractions. My days followed a comfortable rhythm. I'd wake early, brew a pot of coffee, and settle into my home office downstairs. My job as a software developer meant endless hours in front of screens, but the view of the snowy trees outside my window made it bearable. Evenings were for unwinding, reading, cooking, maybe a movie if I felt indulgent. The solitude was a relief after years of living in bustling city apartments, but lately something felt off. It started small, so small I barely noticed. A glass I had placed on the counter ended up on the kitchen table. My phone charger, always plugged in near my desk, was coiled neatly in the bedroom. At first I brushed it off as forgetfulness. I'd been working long hours. It wasn't unusual to misplace things when you were distracted. Then there were the noises. Soft, almost imperceptible creaks from the ceiling, like the sound of weight shifting on old beams. This house wasn't new, and the winter cold often made the wood contract and groan. But some nights, as I sat reading on the couch, the creaks seemed deliberate, as though someone were moving slowly overhead. I tried to dismiss it. My imagination could be dramatic when I was alone for too long. Still, the unease grew. One evening, as I cooked dinner, I noticed the pantry door ajar. I never left it open. I closed it without thinking, only to find it open again the next morning. Old house quirks, I told myself, laughing nervously. But the laugh didn't settle the growing knot in my stomach. A few nights later, as I lay in bed, I heard it again, a distinct creak directly above me. My bedroom was beneath the attic. I froze, straining to listen, my breath caught in my chest. The sound came again, faint but deliberate. Something was moving. I stayed still, heart pounding, convincing myself it was nothing. Maybe a raccoon had found its way into the attic, or a bird seeking shelter. I told myself I'd check it out in the morning, but when daylight came, I avoided the attic entirely. The small disturbances became harder to ignore. A chair in the living room had shifted slightly. My keys, always placed in the same dish by the door, were on the floor. And yet, I told myself I was imagining things. What other explanation could there be? The final straw came late one evening. I had gone to bed, exhausted from a long day of work, and awoke suddenly, unsure why. My eyes adjusted to the darkness, and I reached for my phone to check the time. 3:14 a.m. Something felt wrong, an unsettling stillness that wasn't normal. Then I heard it, a faint scuffing noise, like fabric dragging against wood. It came from the ceiling. My chest tightened as I stared upward, following the sound as it moved slowly across the attic floor, stopping directly above my bed. I held my breath, my mind racing with possibilities, each more terrifying than the last. When morning finally came, I resolved to take action. I needed answers. Whatever was happening, it was no longer something I could dismiss. As I sipped my coffee, my gaze lingered on the pull cord to the attic in the hallway. I considered opening it, but felt a wave of dread so strong I abandoned the idea. Instead, I decided on something less direct, but safer. I ordered a small camera, one I could set up to monitor the living room and the attic entrance. It wasn't paranoia, I told myself. It was precaution. After all, I had to be imagining things, didn't I? The camera arrived 2 days later. As I unpacked it, I felt both ridiculous and relieved. I set it up in the corner of the living room, angling it toward the attic's pull-down ladder. If something or someone was moving around in my house, this would catch it. By the time I went to bed that night, the camera was rolling. For the first time in weeks, I felt a shred of control. Whatever had been unsettling me would finally have an explanation. The morning came uneventfully, but the uneasy weight in my chest remained as I sipped my coffee and glanced at the camera feed on my phone. The live stream showed the living room bathed in soft daylight, with nothing out of place. The attic entrance sat silently in the corner of the frame, its pull cord swaying slightly from the air vent above. I stared at it longer than necessary, waiting for something. But nothing happened. Part of me wanted to review the footage from the night before immediately, but another part hesitated. What if I found something? What if I didn't? Both possibilities felt equally terrifying. I distracted myself with work, but the thought of the camera lingered at the edge of my mind all day. By evening, I couldn't resist any longer. After dinner, I sat on the couch with my laptop, pulled up the recordings, and began to scroll through the hours of footage. Most of it was exactly what I expected. Static images of the empty living room, the quiet hum of the house audible in the background. It was almost reassuring. Almost. As I sped through the early hours of the morning, something caught my eye. The attic pull cord. At 3:07 a.m., it began to sway, not gently as it had during the day, but with a deliberate motion, as if someone were tugging on it from above. My stomach dropped. The swaying continued for several seconds before the cord became completely still again. No other movement followed. I replayed the clip multiple times, leaning in closer with each viewing. It wasn't the wind, there was intention behind the way it moved. My breath quickened, and I paused the video, staring at the frozen image of the cord mid-swing. For a long moment, I sat there, torn between denial and the nagging realization that something was deeply wrong. I closed the laptop and locked every door and window in the house. The rest of the night was spent wide awake on the couch, listening to every creak and groan the house made. The next morning, I knew I had to act. I couldn't ignore this any longer. Armed with a flashlight and a heavy wrench for good measure, I finally pulled the attic ladder down, the sound of the unfolding steps echoing loudly in the quiet house. My hands trembled as I climbed, each creak of the ladder amplifying the pounding of my heart. The attic was cold and smelled of dust and old wood. The beam of my flashlight cut through the darkness, revealing insulation, scattered boxes, and exposed beams. I moved slowly, scanning every corner, every shadow, but it appeared empty. Just as I began to exhale, my flashlight caught something, a disturbance in the thick layer of dust covering the floor. Footprints. They were faint but unmistakable, leading from the far corner of the attic to the trapdoor I had just climbed through. My stomach churned as I followed the trail, the footprints growing clearer until they stopped abruptly in front of a small vent that led to the outside. Someone had been here. I descended the ladder in a daze, slamming the attic door shut behind me. My mind raced with possibilities. Was it a homeless person seeking shelter? A burglar? Or something worse? The thought of someone moving silently through my home, watching me as I slept, sent chills through my body. That night, I didn't sleep. The camera continued to record, but I couldn't bring myself to watch the feed in real time. Every creak of the house made me jump. Every shadow seemed to stretch too far. When dawn finally broke, I decided to contact the police. 2 officers arrived later that morning. I showed them the footage, explained what I had found in the attic, and followed as they conducted a thorough search of the house and surrounding property. They didn't find anyone, but one of the officers pointed out scuff marks near the attic vent, suggesting someone had indeed used it to enter and exit the house. "We'll patrol the area for the next few nights," one of them assured me. "But you should stay somewhere else, just in case." I nodded, but I knew I wouldn't leave. This was my home, and running wouldn't change what had already happened. Besides, I needed answers. That night, I moved the camera to cover my bedroom door. Whatever was happening here, I wasn't going to be caught off guard again. The house was suffocatingly quiet. Every creak of the floor, every whisper of the wind outside felt amplified. The camera sat on my nightstand, its small green light glowing like a sentry, pointed directly at the bedroom door. The attic was sealed shut, but that offered little comfort. Someone had been in my house. Someone might still be here. I lay in bed, clutching my phone as I watched the live feed from the camera. The bedroom door remained motionless, framed perfectly in the shot. I wanted to close my eyes to sleep and escape the creeping anxiety that had taken hold of me, but the thought of missing something kept me wide awake. At 2:47 a.m., the feed flickered. It was brief, barely a second, but it was enough to make my heart stop. I sat up, staring at the screen. The image stabilized, showing the door as it had been before. I convinced myself it was a glitch, some interference from the old wiring in the house. But then at 3:01 a.m., it happened again. This time, the flicker lasted longer, and when the image returned, I saw it. The door was slightly ajar. I froze, my pulse hammering in my ears. I hadn't left it open. My mind raced as I rewound the footage. The door had been closed just minutes earlier. I stared at the screen, hoping, praying it was another glitch. But then the door moved again, inching open ever so slightly. A shadow passed across the threshold. Someone was in the house. I grabbed the heavy flashlight from my nightstand and dialed 911 with trembling fingers. My voice was barely steady as I whispered to the operator explaining the situation. She assured me help was on the way, but every second felt like an eternity. The camera feed continued to flicker intermittently. Each time it came back, the door was open a little wider. I kept my eyes on the screen, clutching the flashlight like a lifeline. Then, at 3:12 a.m., the feed showed something that made my blood run cold. A face. It was pale and gaunt, peering around the edge of the doorframe. The eyes were hollow, wide with a strange intensity, and the corners of the mouth curled into the faintest hint of a smile. The face disappeared as quickly as it had appeared, but the image was burned into my mind. Footsteps. I heard them, soft but deliberate, approaching down the hallway. My heart raced as I backed into the far corner of the room, gripping the flashlight tighter. The door creaked open fully, revealing the silhouette of a man standing in the doorway. He was thin, his clothes tattered, and his movements unnaturally slow, as if savoring the moment. "Get out!" I screamed, raising the flashlight. The man didn't respond. He just stood there, watching me with that unsettling half-smile. The sound of sirens cut through the silence. The man's expression shifted, his smile fading as he turned and bolted down the hall. I heard the front door slam just as red and blue lights illuminated the windows. The police found him hiding in a crawlspace beneath the house. He was disheveled and unkempt, his eyes wild as they led him away in handcuffs. They searched the attic and found his makeshift living quarters, A thin mattress, discarded food wrappers, and a small stack of notebooks filled with incoherent scribbles. He had been there for weeks, watching me, waiting for the perfect moment to reveal himself. The officers reassured me that I was safe now, that the man was in custody. But safety felt like a distant memory. The knowledge that someone had lived above me, listening to my every move, was a weight I couldn't shake. In the days that followed, I tried to return to normal. I replaced the locks, installed more cameras, and even hired a company to seal the attic vent permanently. But the house no longer felt like mine. Every creak of the floorboards, every flicker of shadow sent my mind spiraling back to that face at the door. Eventually, I put the house up for sale. I couldn't stay, not after what had happened. The trauma lingered like a shadow, following me even as I moved to a busy apartment complex in the heart of the city. I surrounded myself with noise and people, desperate to drown out the silence that had once been so comforting. Even now, I can't sleep without checking every corner of my home. I double lock the doors, leave the lights on, and set cameras to cover every possible angle. But no matter what I do, I can't shake the feeling that someone, somewhere, is still watching. The hum of the fluorescent lights overhead was the only sound in the office, punctuated occasionally by the muted click of my keyboard. Outside the tall windows, the Chicago skyline sparkled in the distance, its usual vibrancy dulled by the late hour. The rest of the office was silent, rows of empty desks and chairs forming a grid of solitude. I was the last one here, as usual. I'd grown accustomed to the quiet. Working late into the night had become my routine, a side effect of tight deadlines and my own perfectionist tendencies. The building's air conditioning hummed softly, pushing a faint chill into the air. I wrapped my hands around my mug of coffee, the warmth a welcome reprieve from the cold seeping into my fingers. The office was different at night. By day, it was bustling, phones ringing, conversations overlapping, the printers churning out page after page. But once the sun dipped below the horizon, the space transformed. The long shadows cast by the dimmed lights stretched across the carpet like reaching hands, and the silence pressed down heavier with each passing hour. It was lonely, yes, but also peaceful in a strange way. At least, it used to be. I noticed the first oddity about a week ago. I'd been in the middle of reviewing a report when the lights in the corridor behind me flickered. At first, I thought it was just the building's ancient wiring, but then it happened again the next night, and the night after that. The pattern was too consistent to ignore. Still, I brushed it off. The office was old, the kind of place where the elevators groaned with age and the pipes rattled faintly in the walls. It wasn't unusual for things to malfunction. But then there were the shadows. At first, they were subtle, just flickers at the edge of my vision, like someone moving quickly behind me. Whenever I turned, the space was empty. Tonight, though, felt different. The air seemed heavier, the kind of pressure that made it harder to breathe. I focused on my screen, determined to finish the presentation before my brain spiraled into overthinking. I clicked through slides, the soft glow of the monitor illuminating my face in the dim room. That's when I saw it. It was faint at first, just a smudge of movement reflected in the glossy surface of my computer screen. My fingers froze over the keyboard as I stared at it, my pulse quickening. It was behind me, a shadow darker than the rest, barely visible in the reflection. I turned sharply, my chair squeaking with the sudden motion. Nothing. The room was empty, the desks undisturbed. I exhaled a shaky breath, laughing quietly at my own paranoia. The lack of sleep was clearly getting to me. I shook my head and returned to my work, though my shoulders remained tense, my eyes flicking toward the edges of the screen every so often. As the hours wore on, the flickering lights started again. This time, they weren't just in the hallway, but in the office itself. The ones directly above me dimmed for a moment before buzzing back to full brightness. I leaned back in my chair, staring up at the ceiling, my unease growing. The shadows, the flickers, they were coincidences. They had to be. But the hairs on the back of my neck told a different story. When I finally looked back at my screen, my breath caught in my throat. The shadow was back. It was clearer now, more defined. It wasn't just a smudge, it had shape, tall and human-like, standing perfectly still behind my chair. My heart raced as I forced myself to turn around again, expecting, no, dreading what I might see. The room was as empty as ever. My chair creaked as I rose slowly to my feet, scanning the rows of desks for any sign of movement. I even stepped into the hallway, half expecting to catch someone ducking out of sight, but the corridor was empty, the flickering lights overhead casting eerie patterns on the floor. I returned to my desk, trying to shake the feeling of being watched. The shadow had only been a reflection, a trick of the light. That's what I told myself as I sat back down, though the tension in my shoulders refused to ease. But I couldn't stop thinking about it. Each time I glanced at the monitor, my eyes darted to the corners of the screen, half expecting the shadow to reappear. And though it didn't, the sense of unease lingered, heavier than before. I told myself I was just tired. I told myself it was nothing, but deep down I wasn't so sure anymore. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The quiet hum of the office had turned oppressive, each flicker of the fluorescent lights sending a jolt of unease through me. I tried to focus on my work, clicking through spreadsheets and adjusting numbers that no longer seemed to matter. My concentration was shot, my nerves on edge. The shadow in the reflection kept replaying in my mind. I checked the clock on my monitor, 2:18 a.m. It was later than I thought. The rational part of me told me to pack up and head home. But the nagging sense of unfinished work and the faint embarrassment of my own paranoia kept me rooted to my desk. As I stared at the monitor, my reflection caught my eye again. The glow of the screen illuminated my tired face, and just over my shoulder, I saw it. The shadow was back. It wasn't faint anymore. It was sharper now, more defined, as if it had gained substance. My chest tightened as I slowly turned around. Nothing. The room was empty. I let out a shaky breath, my hands gripping the edge of the desk. "Get a grip, Ethan," I muttered to myself, my voice sounding too loud in the silent room. I was tired, overworked, imagining things. That's all this was. I leaned back in my chair, letting my eyes wander around the office. The rows of empty desks stretched out like a maze, the harsh white glow of the overhead lights barely cutting through the shadows. Everything was still. Too still. The kind of stillness that pressed against your ears and made you hyper-aware of every small sound. Then, from somewhere behind me, I heard it. A faint clicking noise, like someone tapping their fingernails against a hard surface. It was slow, deliberate, and too distinct to ignore. My heart pounded as I turned my head toward the sound. It came from the far side of the room, near the break area, where the lights always seemed dimmer than the rest of the office. "Hello?" My voice wavered, and I hated how small it sounded. No response. The clicking stopped, replaced by a heavy silence that made my skin crawl. I stood up, my chair rolling back slightly, and took a hesitant step toward the break area. The closer I got, the colder the air seemed to grow, like I had walked into a different room entirely. My footsteps felt unnaturally loud against the carpet, and with each step, the unease in my chest grew. When I reached the break area, it was empty. No signs of movement, no signs of anyone else. The faint hum of the vending machine was the only noise. I let out a nervous laugh, trying to shake off the tension. I was working too many late nights, that's all this was. I turned to go back to my desk, but something caught my eye. A faint shadow near the far wall, just at the edge of the light. It didn't move, but its shape seemed wrong, unnatural, as though it was standing upright. My breath hitched as I stared at it, frozen in place. The shadow shifted. It wasn't a trick of the light. It moved just slightly, as if adjusting its stance. My throat went dry as I backed away, my legs feeling like they were wading through molasses. My mind raced, screaming at me to run, but I couldn't tear my eyes away from the shadow. The lights flickered, plunging the room into momentary darkness. When they came back on, the shadow was gone. I stumbled back to my desk, my hands shaking as I fumbled for my phone. I thought about calling someone, anyone, but what would I even say? That a shadow was following me? That I was losing my mind in the middle of an empty office? Instead, I opened the laptop and pulled up the security feed. The cameras were old, their angles limited, but I scanned the footage desperately. My desk, the hallways, the break area, everything seemed normal. There was no sign of movement, no shadow, nothing. But as I rewound the footage, something made my blood run cold. At exactly 2:18 a.m., when I had seen the shadow in my monitor, the camera caught something, a faint, dark figure standing just behind my chair. It stayed there for several seconds before dissolving into nothing. My hand hovered over the mouse, my heart hammering in my chest. Whatever this was, it wasn't my imagination. Something was here with me, and it was getting closer. I stared at the security footage, frozen. The shadow had been there, right behind me. My breath came in shallow gasps, and my mind raced, grasping for any explanation that didn't involve the impossible. A glitch, a smudge on the lens, but none of it could explain how it had moved, how it had dissolved into thin air. I glanced around the office, the quiet now suffocating. The rows of desks felt endless, the shadows between them heavier than they should have been. My hands trembled as I reached for my phone, my thumb hovering over the call button. I wanted to dial 911, but what would I even say? A shadow is stalking me? They'd think I was insane. The lights flickered again, plunging the room into darkness. This time, the hum of the fluorescents didn't return. The glow of my laptop became my only source of light, casting a dim halo around my desk. My reflection stared back at me from the screen, wide-eyed and pale. Behind me, in the monitor's glassy surface, the shadow returned. It was no longer faint. Its shape was sharp and solid, towering behind my chair. I couldn't see a face, just darkness, deep and absolute. My chest tightened as a cold chill washed over me, every instinct screaming at me to run. But I couldn't move. The figure didn't either. It just stood there, waiting. The silence broke with a sharp metallic screech, like nails dragging across the office's ceiling tiles. The sound jolted me into action. I grabbed my flashlight from my desk drawer, its weak beam barely cutting through the oppressive blackness. I swung the light around wildly, my breathing ragged. The shadow was gone, but the chill in the air remained. I stumbled into the hallway, the beam of the flashlight trembling in my hands. The office, once familiar, now felt alien, each corner hiding potential terror. My footsteps echoed unnaturally loud, as though the space itself was amplifying my fear. I turned toward the exit, my only thought to escape, but the door at the end of the hall slammed shut with a deafening bang. A low, guttural sound rose from the darkness, a voice, but not human. It was layered, like several voices speaking in unison, incomprehensible and filled with malice. The chill in the air grew colder, and the flashlight flickered as the sound grew louder. "Leave," the voices whispered, their tones reverberating in my chest. "This is not your place." I ran. I didn't think, didn't look back. The hallway stretched endlessly before me, the flickering flashlight barely keeping the shadows at bay. The voices followed, echoing in my mind, growing louder with each step. My legs felt heavy, the air thick, as though something was trying to pull me back. When I finally burst through the exit door into the stairwell, the world shifted. The air felt warmer, lighter, and the voices disappeared. I practically fell down the stairs, my feet barely catching each step, until I reached the lobby. The bright, artificial lights of the ground floor hit me like a wave of relief. But the fear didn't dissipate. I didn't stop running until I was outside, the cold night air biting at my skin. I leaned against the side of the building, gasping for breath, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. The shadows from the streetlights danced across the pavement, and I flinched at every flicker, my mind unable to let go of what I'd just seen. The next morning, I quit my job. I didn't bother explaining. I didn't want to. The thought of returning to that office, of sitting at that desk again, was unthinkable. Whatever had been there with me wasn't natural, and I couldn't risk another night in its presence. Weeks passed, but the memory lingered. At night, in my apartment, I kept the lights on, the shadows at bay. I couldn't look at screens without seeing faint reflections, half expecting the shadow to return. The fear stayed with me, a constant companion, whispering that what I'd encountered wasn't confined to the office. Sometimes late at night, I catch flickers at the edge of my vision, shadows darker than the rest, shifting when they shouldn't. And in those moments, I wonder if I truly escaped, or if the shadow was always with me, waiting for its next move.